Tony Chu has a secret he rarely discloses to anyone. The secret is that Tony has an unusual eating problem with food. The worst thing about it is that he is always ever hungry but terrified of eating. For in all honesty, Tony Chu is a Cibopath. To be frank with you, this is the first time I have heard the word Cibopath. As a Cibopath, Tony Chu has the psychic ability to read the consciousness of anything that touches his mouth, be it meat or plant, or should I say flesh. And to be candid, this was a weird situation for him. It's like this. Let's say Tony bites an apple. He will begin to have a symbiotic consciousness with the apple by knowing its origin, who planted it, what tree it grew on, and the pesticide used on it, and even go further in knowing the identity and activities of the grower. And the same thing happens when he eats meat by himself, knowing when the cow he's eating from was born, nurtured to grow, and killed. In plain English, he experiences everything the animal went through, including the pain. All this experience made eating difficult, so Tony had no choice but to live on cans of beets, for it's the only thing he eats that doesn't give him a psychic sensation. You should be aware that Tony Chu is a police officer who goes by the book and has a partner by the name of John Colby. Tony doesn't like him because John can be a renegade, unorthodox, and most of the time reckless, which can be irritating. Now, after the bird flu epidemic, the government banned all birds from the consumption of food in the guise of preventing the further spread of the virus. But this led to criminals taking advantage of the opportunity to make some money for themselves by illegally selling bird products in the black market. Now, Tony Chu and John Colby were on a stakeout, and most importantly, this was their last night. They are trying to apprehend a notorious criminal with itchy fingers called the Bear, one of the masterminds behind selling birds illegally for consumption and otherwise. Across the road from them was a building that they know the Bear visits to make illegal transaction, and it should be known that the Bear had been suspected of killing 5 people. With his binoculars, John Colby observed anyone going in and out of the building. At first glance, he saw someone coming out of the building with a few bird products, but they were more interested in the Bear, known to be the one running the show. Out of nowhere, John Colby, through his binoculars, observed someone carrying a large number of bird products, which he notified Tony Chu about. Still, unfortunately for both of them, it was Tony's brother, Cho Chu, who is a television chef that had a mental breakdown on live TV due to the fact on the government's ban on chicken. And on that day, he went on a conspiracy theory tirade about the ban on chicken and that the government has a hidden agenda. Now, what the hidden agenda is only known to Cho Chu. But before he could do any more damage to the food network he was working for, he was suspended for 8 months, and the food network was levied $4 million. Tony, who was a principled and by-the-book police officer, decided to get out of their hideout to arrest his brother for breaking the law. But his partner, John Colby, was having none of it, trying to make Tony see sense that him apprehending his brother would blow their cover, put his brother in prison for a long time. And to be frank and to be honest, they are here for the arrival of the Bear, who was worse than Cho. But Tony insisted on arresting his brother, and once again, John Colby was having none of it. He grabbed Tony back in the van, trying his best to make an adamant Tony see his perspective. And just like that, the Bear and his henchmen arrived at the scene, where they immediately packed up their ammunition to face and apprehend him. As they were about to make their way to arrest him, an agent from the FDA by the name of Mason Savor stopped them from making the arrest on the basis that the Bear, going by his real name, Deshaun Berry, had made a special arrangement with the FDA FDA. The FDA stands for Food and Drug Administration, and they struck a deal with the bear to pass on information to them from time to time and continue his illegal bed business, and warned both Tony Chu and John Colby to stay away from him, for this was done for the greater good. As expected, they were furiously disappointed, as it's known that they had been on the stakeout for weeks just to be told to back off on the last day. Mason Savor made them understand there was no point in them protesting against this call, for it was above their pay grade and this was not their jurisdiction. It's FDA. In a gesture of his candor and appreciation of their cooperation, and from one law officer to the other, Mason Savor gave them a password to use in a black market where they can have the best poultry meals you can ever dream of. And this was a small courtesy from the FDA. Feeling a bit disappointed and having no say in the matter, Tony Chu and John Colby decided to go to the illegal poultry restaurant from the black market. And before getting there, John warned Tony not to behave awkwardly, for he might expose them as undercover police officers. As soon as they got to the restaurant, John ordered a large meal which consisted of chicken drumsticks and a Coke to wash it down, while a cautious Tony just asked for chicken soup, to John Colby's dissatisfaction. The truth is that even though he is a police officer, John Colby doesn't agree with the ban on poultry. He believes the government who he works for is overreaching. Unlike his pious partner Tony, he believes otherwise. Tony thinks they are hypocrites for indulging in the eating in a restaurant operating an illegal poultry business. But from John Colby's perspective, who cares? As they were eating their meal, although John Colby was more or less devouring his chicken drumstick, Tony Chu began developing his psychic abilities due to tasting the chicken soup he was served, and a whole data of information began to flood his mind. It was like he was there. And just so you know, his partner John Colby is aware of his psychic metaphysical abilities. There was a serial killer on the loose, and Tony Chu could feel everything he did to his victims. He was chopping them to bits, and he did some nefarious act on them menacingly and then eats them. Tony revealed his name and identity as Tracy Lee Cobb, one of the sole chefs in the restaurant. And to make matters worse, he was going to strike again, for Tony Chu can feel his urge at the present moment. Swift to action and not wasting any time, John Colby encouraged Tony to shake it off, as they have a new mission without any interference from the FDA. They both went to the kitchen, and to their surprise, there was more than one sous chef. John Colby, who had been itching for some action, told everyone in the kitchen to stay calm, and stupidly, without asking his partner Tony Chu what the serial killer looks like, he called out the person named Tracy Lee Cobb to raise his hands and walk forward. A reward for his stupidity and eagerness came to effect, for it wasn't Tracy Lee Cobb that came forward, but his meat cleaver, which he swung at John Colby, who was hit on the side of his face, and before you could say Jack Robinson, there was blood everywhere. At the same time, Tracy Lee took to his heels and made for his escape through the back door of the restaurant. At this point, Tony Chu was in a state of shock to see his partner bleeding profusely. He tried to help him, but John told him to go after Tracy Lee Cobb. That was more important. Without hesitation, Tony ran after the serial killer, and when he got close to Tracy Lee Cobb, he told him to freeze, in which a desperate Tracy Lee Cobb tried to go for the attack, but Tony Chu made him understand that he was holding a gun and that he is in no position to overcome his predicament with a knife. Now, what amazes Tracy Lee Cobb is that Tony Chu knows every detail of his crime like he was there, and wondering who in the blue hell he was, for he thought he had been careful in his nefarious ways undetected detected, and not until now he'd successfully kidnapped his victims and stuck to the same routine without fail. Understanding that his end is nigh, he does the most desperate thing ever done by a serial killer. He sliced his own throat in anticipation of not ending up in prison. A shocked, frantic Tony Chu knew it was too late to get information on the whereabouts of his late victims, for Tracy Lee Cobb was choking from his blood. So our hero, the Cibopath, had no choice but to get the information needed by chewing on Tracy Lee Cobb's flesh, in which he used his psychic ability to find where Tracy Lee Cobb buried all of his victims. Later, it was discovered that Tracy Lee Cobb was no ordinary serial killer. He was a menace. He had kidnapped and killed 13 girls across 5 states and 8 countries. Some cases had gone cold. When the police first got to his house, they found a refrigerator full of human heads and meat. An ice chest in his car was filled with chicken breasts as he was smuggling them out of the restaurant, as well as traces of human fillets he was using to cut the soup. This means that Tracy Lee Cobb was not only feeding on human flesh, but also feeding his customers without their knowledge. Yuck! Just to let you know, our reckless, unorthodox hero, John Colby, is in surgery. The chief of police informed Tony Chu about the bear, who is wanted for a series of murders, for he has turned out to be an informant for the FDA. And worst of all, the bear has gone missing in action. As much as Tony Chu is commended for a job well done in solving a case that in all reality couldn't be solved, the chief of police wanted to know why it took 2 police officers to pull him off Tracy Lee Cobb's sliced dead throat body, and most importantly, how he learned that Tracy Lee Cobb was a serial killer. He wasn't on the police data, nor did he fit the profile. Tony Chu refused to explain himself because, in all honesty, he might be looked upon as a weirdo. The chief was curious about how he knew the names and circumstances of the death of every victim. This was unusual, and this caused a great suspicion in the police department, which involved the internal affairs, his lawyer, the police department, psychiatrist, and to top it all, the FDA. This was a headache for the chief of police, as all the departments were on his neck. He knows Tony is a good police officer, but how will he back him up on being seen chewing on a dead corpse? Just out of the blues, without him knocking at the door, was Mason Savor from the FDA. As he walks in on the chief and Tony Chu, and letting Tony Chu know that he understands how he solved the case and that he has immediately become the employee of the Special Crimes Division of the Federal Government of the United States of America, the FDA.